No, she's not. What is her accent?
In Manhattan.
Yeah.
So we need a Manhattan
What was her
accent.
real name?
It's Gia. It's Italian last name. It's like Gia Motti, Gia Minetti, something.
And how old do you think she is? What would you say?
I thought
30s?
she's in her
Early
20s.
20s.
It's like 23, 24.
And she's, if you haven't seen her, has anybody not seen her? She's very, very sexy, way out there, right? Yeah, right.
She dresses outrageously.
Yes, depends on your taste, that's right. So she says, I'm single right now. I've chosen to be single because I don't have the time to get to know anybody. So it's okay not to have sex. It's okay to get to know people. I'm celibate. Celibacy's fine. So here she is. And
So that begs the question, is it for an expedient reason? I mean, it's just there, but if a guy came along or somebody else came along.
She'd partake.
I think she
Yeah,
needs,
I mean,
I
that
think
really
she needs
does.
the last 3 weeks.
but so why else? There she's on record as saying, it just takes too much time right now. I've got other things to fry. Why else would a person choose to be celibate?
It sounds like her situation is not as much by choice as much by dilemma and by her career.
Mm-hmm.
And so therefore, I think it's a lot easier for people to accept that and say, oh, well, yeah, she's way too busy. That so many celebrities are that busy. And that's why their relationships with celebrities can't hold up.
Well, the one
But
thing
she's also, it's part of her act.
Yeah.
I mean, in all honesty, it's sort of,
Is it?
yeah, everybody, you can be who, all of the, she just tries to appeal to all different peoples. So actually, for me, I think it's part of the act.
the show.
I have to confess a very strong bias against Anne. And the whole discussion,
Mother Anne.
Mother Anne, and the whole discussion about Anne's celibacy. If I were gonna make a case to demonstrate that Anne's celibacy was not motivated by a desire to embrace grace, but was pathological, I think there'd be an abundance of evidence. Here's this woman married to a guy who's apparently mundane, to put it euphemistically, not terribly nice. She has this terrible, terrible experience with childbearing, which to me, to make the leap from that experience to not wanting to have sex is not a big leap. But embracing celibacy if you're not a nun is socially difficult. So what do? You set up a community. You get people around you who will validate and accept what you want to do, which is to not have sexual relations of any sort with men or women. And I think that's there's a strong argument that that's what she did. I mean, there was not a whole lot of doctrine, you're saying, Jerry, during her leadership. It was just kind of a cult of the personality and cult of her own pathology. And I don't know who was attracted at that point, whether it was like-minded people who also had very bad experiences with their sex lives and didn't want any part of it. And the idea of kind of wrapping grace around the decision to be celibate was really a way to have it accepted, to have that celibacy accepted. But what was driving was, I don't want anything to do physically that smacked of any sexuality. So I'm afraid of it, I don't like it, I had a bad experience with it, and I'm going to justify it by saying there's a certain aspect of purity to it. With the Jews, when God afflicted Eve by saying that childbirth would be painful, God did not say, and you shall not bear children, and you shall not have sex. That wasn't said.
But I think the Lady Gaga thing is a great thing because she and the Shakers certainly later knew whom they were performing for as well. And I think that
I think that's a very good point.
the fact that Jesus was celibate, Buddha, et cetera, she, certainly knew that this idea of purity came along with the idea of celibacy, and she was preaching her, her story here, and I think she knew how that would play.
Any others? Matt?
As I know virtually nothing about Methodism or the history of religions, but as you were talking about the role of spiritualism in connection with the dead of the Shakers' history, I thought you were about to talk about a group that did the very opposite of become celibate, namely the Mormons.
What?
Mormons. And I think it's sort of interesting that they too,
Also upstate New York.
also upstate
Also
New York,
evangelical.
also had a very similar history of the second coming of Christ, and their reaction to sex was rather different.
Well,
And indeed, it survived to
And grew.
So,
more successful.
celibacy has almost nothing to do, it seems to me, with the underlying religious character. It has something to do with something altogether different.
Well, I don't think so. I think from what you said, all mysticism and monasticism have always gone very closely together. The idea that you're totally giving your life to something which is not of the flesh. So you don't eat so much food in monastic situations, you don't have the personal connections, and then you're also celibate. It all goes together. Now exactly what directed Mother Ann in this route, I think is another question. But many people who've been really entirely absorbed in religion, they don't have any time for anything other than that. That's essentially what it is. They've put everything out of their lives apart from this one particular aim, which is something towards God.
Or alternatively, they've just become absorbed with the subject.
Well,
they take very different roots from their total absorption with that subject. One of them is utter monasticism and utter abstention, and the other is the very opposite.
Well, what we were talking yesterday, this borderline between spirituality, and mysticism.
Yes.
And all of this comes into it. People have visions, that's mystical, and apparently one of the visions that Mother Ann had, that the act of coition was what we would say was Adam eating the apple. That's her interpretation of that other mythical
Right.
story.
She saw them Adam and Eve having sex and being thrown out.
And that was
That
it.
was it.
That was the apple.
But I think back to Herb's point, it may be, you may be right, Herb, we will never know that Anne Lee's devotion to celibacy came from her bad experience and was pathological. However, her followers, many years later, who do not have, many of whom do not have the same experience, many of whom were married coming into the community, many of whom loved their spouses and expressed that love, nevertheless accepted celibacy as the buying in card. So I think we have to look and see what it did for them, what could have been the reason. So I do want to tell you a little bit about the benefits of the website before we get to what it did for the Shakers. But here are some of the things people have said about what value celibacy played in their life, what it gave them. I enjoy feelings of self-worth, empowerment, and individuality. I socialize with and date the opposite sex without the pressures and awkwardness of negotiating sex. I know that someone loves me for who I am rather than what I can give them sexually. I avoid an unexpected or unwanted pregnancy. I avoid catching one of over 20 sexually transmitted diseases. I avoid the heartbreak, regret, anger, and emotional turmoil that a failed sexual relationship brings. I avoid giving away something precious only to be left feeling used and worthless. I enjoy healthier dating without having to focus on sex. I enjoy feeling emotionally healthy and stronger, more able to face the future. So those are people writing into this site. What do you think about those statements?
A lot of avoids.
A lot of avoids, yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to say that what's missing, from the 21st century list is what would have loomed very large for 19th century women, certainly, was that pregnancy was very, very dangerous. And not only for the fevers and infections, but there was a tuberculosis epidemic in this country starting in the first quarter of the 19th century, and latent tuberculosis was stirred up by pregnancy and childbirth, so that it was very, very dangerous. I mean, not only the childbed statistics, but the TB statistics were skewed by pregnancy, so it was really like playing Russian roulette every time you got pregnant. And that's very hard to, but what a powerful motivation for any woman with a brain to.
It certainly a focus at that time period. People are making choices.
Yeah, and it wasn't just poor women in cities, and it was terrible to TB.
Ruth, do you want some time on gender today?
Yeah, we're gonna get there. I promise you. All right, so what could it have done for the Shakers? So let's, we're saying that Shakers, whether or not they had a pathological reason for celibacy, were buying into celibacy. And what, from your reading, do you have a sense of why, or if you were a Shaker, can you imagine why you would give up sex? What would it do for you? What would it give you? What would it give you in community? What would it give to the community? How would you imagine that?
Well, I think one item which goes in these instances is reinforcement. If you're with other people that are believing the same thing, it's easier than if you're just trying to do it on your own.
Okay.
I think that's one thing.
So if you want to be celibate.
Well, or
if you want to.
Yes, or if you've got these higher motivations, it's easier to, and that becomes, that's part of what you're thinking, but not all of what you're thinking. Then if you're with people who have that similar view, then it's easier to go all the way, so to speak. I think the other point, which is, that seems to me that the success of the Shakers was due to a composite of a number of different matters of living together, which Meacham worked out. And I think it was probably easier to run communities of this kind if they were celibate. If instead of people having families and wanting things for their families and in opposition to other families, it wouldn't have worked. I mean, the Amishes managed to work something out of this kind pretty well, but by and large, it's easier to run a community where you don't come into those problems.
Well, let's hold that. What do you think about that? Is it easier to run a community when you don't run into those problems? What are those problems?
Just think about camp.
Okay.
Boys camp, girls camp, boys leader, girls leader. Otherwise, alliances form that have nothing to do with the community. It becomes difficult for people to buy into, common goals and so forth, and common priorities.
Because why?
Because loyalties become divided at best.
Because
your loyalty can be towards your little unit.
Your sexual partner.
Well,
or your friend.
Or your friends.
Or your friend.
Well, of course, we have to remember that it's a communistic society. Now, of course, the Amishes are not communistic. And that was the difference. If you were going to be in a community, and then they read into this, the early Christians and what St. Paul had said and so forth about everyone having everything in common. It's very hard to do that where you've got multiple families.
But to Ruth's question,
what would it give the community, and particularly the organizations? It would give them fuel. I mean, if you can redirect all that energy that would otherwise be spent in individual relations and sexual